This is Deep Down, and I'm your host, Jordan Hunt. I'm a composer, vocalist, multi-instrumentalist, and self-releasing artist. You might also know me as former violinist in the Irrepressibles, as the long-standing musical companion to Grammy-nominated Olivia Chaney, or as a musical and associate director of the Theo Adams Company. I delve deep as we explore the creative process and life through the lens of a musician, unraveling universal ideas and enigmas through some of my songs and lyrics, and through some of the profound moments that have shaped me. Join me deep down as we embark on this journey together, in search of answers to the elusive question, what do you really feel deep down? For me, teaching is listening. Perhaps that sounds a little counterintuitive, as we all assume the point of teaching is to impart knowledge, but to do so blindly can miss the opportunity to be simultaneously a teacher and a learner. With over 20 years of teaching experience, I share some of the moments that led me to this conclusion and unpick what exactly do I mean, and what does it mean deep down to be both a practicing and teaching musician. Welcome, listeners. I realise that during this podcast series so far, I've mentioned teaching quite a few times. In fact, I went into some detail in episode 3, Practice Makes Perfection, where I discussed practice in my own performance life and also in relation to my pupils and my own daily rituals. And to be honest, this really is the first time in my career as a musician that I've even publicised the fact that I teach, alongside my work as an artist and performer. I think retrospectively, perhaps subliminally, I wasn't sharing anything with the world about my music teaching due to some inbuilt default bias I had about teaching being less than compared to performing or composing or touring. It's certainly not seen as glamorous or particularly exciting, but the more I teach, the more I realise how much I get from it as a professional musician, and how it fills me with energy and gives me a well-rounded approach to my own work. And through some recent film adaptations of famous and fictional musicians such as Leonard Bernstein's portrayal in Maestro and Cate Blanchett's conductor character in Tar, it's opened my eyes to a romanticised way of viewing mentorship in masterclasses, etc. And it's funny because I don't think any of my friends or family have ever insinuated that teaching is less than. I have to figure out where that bias comes from within me, I think. Because, of course, I'd be nothing without my own teachers. So, in this episode, I'm very excited to share with you today some of my perspectives on teaching, which I've had the pleasure and privilege to do for the past 20 plus years or so. For those of you who don't know, I play and teach violin, viola, piano, composition, songwriting, and music theory. And I'm even on the board of examiners for Trinity music theory exams. I'm not sure if that's a state secret or something. I doubt the music theory police will come after me for revealing I'm on the panel. They're far more likely to come after me for using parallel fifths in a Bach chorale, to be honest. That's a very geeky musical in-joke, and I won't even try to bore you with an explanation right now. But spending a large portion of my days as a music teacher, I've had the privilege to not only listen to a wide array of music and genres, but also to unravel the intricacies of the human mind, exploring the psychology of my students as I try to crystallize my thoughts over time to figure out the best way to communicate how to assist them. And it's fascinating to decipher what drives them and the barriers they unwittingly place upon themselves, that I also recognize in myself. And then the universal aspects of learning and life that we all face. I mean, although as adults we're for the most part not at school, we're always learning. And of course there's a profound role that music plays in all of our lives. And it can get deep very quickly, depending on one's level of self-awareness. And trying to gauge people's level of self-awareness is also fascinating because it helps me in where to pitch an explanation or a critique. And let me tell you, giving constructive criticism really is an art form, which I suppose is at the crux of my job. I try to explain as early as possible no matter how old the pupil that I'm teaching, that ideally what I'm trying to do is instill this critical self-awareness so that people can teach themselves. It's actually quite rare to be passing on a bunch of facts. It's far more likely that I draw people's attention to things they already knew but were ignoring or were in denial about, or more fundamentally, teaching people how to learn. I mean, when do we ever learn to learn? At school, we're given lists of facts, and if you're lucky, you might be given a method to work something out. But I don't remember explicitly ever being told, this is how to write an essay, for example. And certainly in my early days as a violinist or pianist, I don't really recall being taught how to practice, as I mentioned in my earlier episode on practice. I remember picking up tips from my pianist flatmate at university about how to structure a 2-hour practice room session and how many breaks to take and how to focus your thoughts. But in my school days of learning the violin and piano, I don't really remember being told in those short 20 or 30-minute lessons how to go about spending my hour a day. I was just given a piece or 3 pieces and 7 scales and told go away and learn them. What's interesting though is that during my work as a music educator, I spend a lot of my time listening, observing and communicating my perspectives with other people, hence the title of this week's episode. And very often I find weekly trends where I'll find myself repeating and refining the same ideas. For example, this past week, the recurring theme seems to be about priorities or having an intention or an agenda every time you practice a passage. It's really so easy to just want to start at the beginning and get to the end to enjoy playing something through. And of course, with the majority of adult learners that I teach, it's certainly about enjoying playing music. But if there is any sort of work that goes on, then you really need to be quite pragmatic and methodical about it. And if you know, there are a few things to consider, for example, the tuning and intonation, or the rhythm, or the articulation, or the speed, or how 2 sections link together, then that's already an enormous amount of multitasking that needs to go on. And realistically, when you're already at capacity, you need to pick one priority to look at in this pass to be able to gauge if you're even getting it, and then devote another pass to looking at another element, and then and only then perhaps combine them to see if you can manage both at the same time. It's so funny that I don't really remember ever being taught this myself. I was probably very unorganized about my practice when I was younger. I was definitely someone who was very lucky to be able to sight read quickly, which means just looking at the music for the first time and then playing it at sight. And so I could probably get away without practicing very much. But of course that didn't lead to especially deep practice sessions. Maybe I was just bamboozling my violin teacher this whole time, that I'm sure she could see straight through me and that I wasn't practicing. I was just doing a good impression of the piece. These days in the teacher's seat, like I said, I find myself repeating some universal observations, such as this week's priorities concept. And as well as repeating my same observations and trends of thought, I also begin to witness the same mistakes reappearing across the board with different people, even playing different instruments. But it's almost like humans are hardwired to make the same kinds of mistakes, and they can be prompted by the way a passage of music is notated in a confusing way, or a certain combination of rhythms that's repeated and conditions you to expect a certain pattern, and then the pattern's thwarted and perhaps people don't notice. But it's quite delightful really to see these same patterns of behaviour appearing across the board in violin or viola or piano, or even in music theory exercises. The only way I've managed to take teaching to this next level for me is effectively to switch modes from imparting knowledge to observing and listening. That alone has been the single biggest factor in the improvement of my teaching, and has also increased the enjoyment levels manyfold. It means that I'm perhaps a bit more selective about the teaching jobs I take on now, as some positions really require a babysitting and cramming attitude, which I have very little interest in really. I'm now incredibly lucky to work with mainly adults who have a clear intention behind why they're learning an instrument at all, and so I can listen to their individual needs and tailor the approach to suit them. Of course, that's not to say that I don't impart any knowledge at all, watching pupils in silence. It's just now, after listening and observing, I'm in a much better position to offer bespoke approaches for technical changes or studies or pieces, etc., rather than simply going on to the next piece in the book just because it's the next piece in the book. In fact, this constant refining of my observations is one of the main reasons I wanted to make this podcast. In a way, the craft of teaching, if you can call it a craft, is trying to refine the clearest and most engaging way to get something across. And often you're repeating yourself many, many times, in the case of beginners especially. But in fact, it's amazing how many similarities I find in the messages I'm trying to convey with beginners and more advanced pupils alike. And I really love that process of refining. It's a little like improvisation. And I'm trained in classical composition, which is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum to improvising. So I found that when I'm called upon to improvise, for example, when I was accompanying the legendary Baby D and Little Annie on tour, and I was playing violin, in theory I was supposed to be improvising a part along with their very free and sporadic and sometimes erratic arrangements of their own songs. I'm sure they won't mind me alluding to this wild approach. Baby D is very fond of misbehaving whenever she gets the chance. And I found that I was quite instinctively composing on the spot, which I suppose is a sort of approach to improvising, but that every time I performed the same songs over the months of that tour, the parts would ebb and flow and get a little bit closer to perfection each time, if that's attainable. There were always factors out of my control, as those two chanteuses had so much character. I was definitely in their wake, riding the wave. But to connect the analogy back to teaching, I find myself repeating the same themes and ideas and concepts over and over again until I get it right. And those themes can be repeated over a year, or they can shift from week to week. And each time there are elements out of my control, because obviously I'm responding in the moment to someone playing and learning. And to connect it back to my podcast, I find that I'm trying to refine my thoughts or distill my thoughts to a point where I can share them. And I'll probably look back in a couple of years and think, I've definitely moved on in my thoughts about that particular aspect of music or life. But this is a nice document of where I'm at now. When I started teaching, I assumed everyone was starting from an equal playing field, and that if I was consistent in my approach to teaching the same method across the board, I would get the same results. I have no idea where I got that idea from. I suppose it's because I was learning how to teach on the job at first, with quite little guidance other than the support of the music education leaders who were running the administration of offering instrumental tuition in schools where I started my career. But how wrong I was. I realise now just how different everyone is and how every single person needs a unique approach despite the same themes and mistakes recurring. And I often joke that teaching adults is a bit like being their therapist. It's so humbling to meet and try to help so many humans, and even more fascinating to witness and develop boundaries in action, seeing where people's limits are when it comes to new information, or how relaxed or professional their overall vibe is. I try to respect all of their unspoken boundaries at the same time as imparting my own rather implicit and explicit boundaries, which has been so useful for me in my personal and mental development too. I assume it's implicit, but to be explicit, boundaries are so important for lessons, for both parties, because in order to be open and vulnerable to learning, there need to be enormous levels of trust, to be seen and observed and critiqued, and also to be simply heard. I mean, I also joke to my pupils that I'm psychic, because I can almost see behind what they're playing to know what's going through their mind before they make a mistake, because I've made it before. And I've seen countless other students make the same mistake in that same way before. Of course, I'm not psychic, I'm just observing patterns. I imagine there must be some kind of innate sensitivity to being this critical observer, but I'm constantly trying to understand the psychology of others in order to help. And it's a very humbling pastime that's then very difficult not to do in my everyday life to my partner and friends and loved ones. I need to try and stop myself from going into teacher mode. My partner sometimes jokes and says, every moment is a teachable moment, when I haven't quite caught that I'm going into explanation mode. I mean, I'm literally passing on knowledge right now. I very obviously have some sort of inclination or drive to teach. I think for my character it must be very natural. And having a captive audience, of course, is perfect for an introvert because I don't have to fight for attention. I mean, I've definitely done my dues school teaching for over 15 years, and even whole class violin lessons where you're literally teaching 30 children how to play the violin at once, which I only experienced for the first time in my 30s, actually. I thought it was some sort of urban legend that I didn't believe existed before that. I couldn't conceive of how it would work, but having assisted some incredible tutors who lead whole class violin lessons, I learned that it is definitely possible and actually highly effective and efficient way to start and give everyone a go. Of course, in that sort of scenario, I was definitely fighting for the attention of the class, which for me was rather unrewarding. I didn't have those kind of extrovert skills so naturally. It didn't come to me very easily, so I consider myself very grateful now to find my niche as a private tutor. There are so many musicians who teach to subsidise their income, and I remember a composer friend who's a few years older than me who once said that she was planning to stop teaching beyond the age of 30. I mean, she told me this when I was in my early 20s, that it was just a financial necessity for her and that if she could help it, that was her cut-off point. And it really stuck with me because it felt like I was getting the message that it's not a desirable future. She obviously didn't enjoy it so much. And almost by osmosis, I assumed, oh, I probably shouldn't enjoy it either. But when I really think about the elements of teaching that I didn't used to enjoy, it's probably the 50-minute uphill cycle at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning, come rain or shine, when I was saving money on the tube, or the 2-hour round-trip commute from East London to Chiswick to teach for 1 hour. The actual teaching itself, I think I've always loved. In the way I teach now, mainly from my studio in East London, with more boundaries in place, more self-awareness about which elements I enjoy, and more control over avoiding taking on pupils that perhaps are only focused on getting through the exams rather than enjoying music on a deeper level. I love it. It has taken me 20 years to get to this point, though. I've certainly earned my dues and feel like I can listen to the process and fine-tune my boundaries to reflect my needs, to make sure that I can look after myself and that the pupils get the best of me every lesson. As I'm recording this, it's currently my main source of security, and I feel incredibly lucky to have a very fine roster of loyal pupils, many of whom I've been teaching for several years. You know, when the pandemic hit and we went into lockdown, there was this first week where everything suddenly changed and everything was up in the air, and like a stack of dominoes, one by one, all my pupils called or texted to communicate that they would be having an indefinite pause. And I was totally panicked, as I assume most musicians were, whose livelihood had been stripped from them in one fell swoop. Of course, most of my pupils were going through their own uprooting, and it was courteous of them to let me know that their situation had changed, but I certainly panicked and thought, wow, I never realised that my whole financial structure is based on this security. So I hustled and basically emailed anyone I'd ever taught with a plea to try to convince people to switch to online tuition rather than in person. And quite honestly, it saved me. It kept me relatively afloat over the various lockdowns and actually proved to work out well. I invested in a proper studio mixer and mic for teaching online eventually, and worked out the best way to get high quality sound so my pupils would hear me well. And now I still currently teach a handful of pupils online who no longer live in London or for whom it's too inconvenient to travel in person to lessons. I only wish I had shares in Zoom before it all started. Anyway, this is more about the practicalities of life as a music teacher, which is very much a part of it. In fact, there's a constant push-pull of compromise and boundary testing with each individual pupil, which happens in both directions. Suffice to say that people's needs are incredibly wide-ranging, and what's so humbling is when I realise that perhaps I'm not the person who can fulfil their needs. For example, with some of the young people I've recently taught piano, composition, music theory too, they've now continued on to junior further education at the Royal Academy Saturday School and the Purcell School and Chetham's School of Music, the latter two which are residential boarding schools, all of which can offer a totally immersive musical experience and social network of like-minded young people that I obviously would struggle to offer from my tiny 6-metre square studio in Whitechapel. I'm always so proud of these next steps, though. Of course, I sometimes battle with my ego about passing them on to new teachers who are probably ever more niche than I am. I mean, I do offer quite a range of tuition, but I like to think to a high level, and on more than one occasion, a pupil who's left my tutelage has actually come back to me for a top-up lesson as their new teacher is so different, and I can perhaps offer something unique that even I didn't realise I was offering them. I think one of the most painful things for the ego is turning down lesson requests from prospective pupils who have a strong instinct that I wouldn't be right for them, or to be able to offer them quite what they're after. And then I reassure myself by remembering that that specific path or way of learning, for example, aiming to do all the big piano competitions or the concerti, is not what I specifically love about teaching. Not to say that I'd be unable to help someone prepare, but having taken countless pupils through their exams, there's certainly a rigour and repetition to this kind of tuition with a certain kind of person that can, veer away from enjoyment. And I don't like to find myself in that space, especially when you end up spending as much energy dealing with the ego of the overambitious helicopter parent as you might do in the actual teaching. But luckily that's quite a rare case, and I think currently all the parents of the young people that I teach are not only sympathetic to the approach I take, but also in agreement that if it ever stops being enjoyable, then something needs to change. In fact, this morning I had a request for lessons from a parent whose 15-year-old she was trying to find a new piano teacher for, to eventually prepare for the Leeds piano competition, which is a very big league competition. I gently suggested that she should perhaps benefit from being in an immersive musical environment such as a specialist music school. And I caught my ego flaring up as she continued in the exchange to test me about whether I was capable of teaching to such a high level. And after her overlong introductory message, my instincts were definitely on high alert that this particular parent might be a nightmare to work with. Though, of course, I never rule something out based on a text message, but in the end, it really felt like her approach, or her hoped approach, differed so wildly from mine that I had to just wish her well on her search rather than engage in the "am I good enough" route of questioning that she was starting down, because luckily I now know after so many years of teaching where my strengths lie, and that's definitely at the holistic end of the spectrum rather than the perhaps old school drilling approach that many people associate with the stereotypical music lesson. I think in that case I ought to have listened to my first instinct before even engaging in conversation, actually, as I felt a little rotten after that exchange. But the listening really is the point for me. Listening to myself, listening to my instincts, and listening to pupils rather than pushing them somewhere they don't naturally want to go. On that note, I was reading a chapter in Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act, A Way of Being. From the little I read, it's definitely worth the investment. It's quite a big book. But luckily, when flipping through, my eyes settled on the short chapter about listening. And so much of his thoughts on listening were in line with my own opinions and instincts about what's really going on in the room when I'm observing and listening to a pupil play or talk about where they're at. Because sometimes I do find myself preparing a response before somebody has finished playing, which of course is the critical ear at work. But he said the beautiful thing: listening is suspending disbelief. And that when truly listening, we are fully present in a two-way exchange, giving our full attention. That, I hope, is true of the way I listen, that I'm totally present and that the speaker communicates differently when being listened to fully. He talks about how when we're forming opinions or responses about whether someone is right or wrong before they've even finished, we're doing them and ourselves a disservice, where we might miss information that might alter your current thoughts. This is where it was interesting to me, as when listening to someone play, really, I'm comparing them to every other person who's ever played anything in front of me, whizzing through this database at 1,000,000 miles per microsecond, to try to gather data to give a helpful response. But the moments I enjoy most are the moments just after listening, where there's a silence, perhaps it's an awkward silence for the pupil, but where I can really think about what was presented. And often in that moment of silence, I'm not only thinking about helpful critical observations, but also about what's the best way to word this, given what I know about interactions with humans in general and my history of interacting with this specific person, which is really fascinating to be so aware of that in the present moment. And in fact, you might have heard a horn in the background because I'm recording this in a real-life room in the real world. The final line in Rick Rubin's short chapter on listening is not just awareness, but freedom from accepted limitations, which is also very beautiful, because sometimes I'm surprised by a marked improvement from someone and get very excited to wonder, how did that happen? What changed between this pass and the previous pass? And this is where I love to pick people's brains about how they were thinking about something or approaching something differently, so that I might gather that information for future wisdom. It's a funny way to put it, but at some point down the line, something might click in my head where I connect the dots of what this person just described and another similar moment with someone else. I wouldn't claim that wisdom as my own, but rather a universal wisdom that in theory we all have access to if we're just listening with open enough ears. And in lessons, I'm not the only person listening. I'm really trying to train people to listen to themselves, which you'd expect was automatic, but trust me, it really isn't. As I said earlier, I'm trying to instill in people this potential of critical self-awareness where hopefully we can reach the stage where I've effectively taught myself out of a job. It can be a sort of uncomfortable process sometimes, being a mirror to people's automatic responses, or making them aware of the way they speak to themselves when they're being a bit hard on themselves. And as well as listening to what they need musically, listening to their reactions to see how deep you can go with an idea. I think the most exciting thing comes when, thanks to the way someone responds to a universal concept like, let's try to make the bow sound staccato. By listening to what they're specifically struggling with, I might come up with a workaround that I've never tried with anyone else in 20 years. And that ends up being an idea that I'll steal for a later lesson with someone else to try out the same trick, which keeps the process alive and present for me, which is important because I do find myself sometimes saying the same kinds of things on loop to the point of them being predictable. But to be fair, I still hold on to concepts and ideas that I was taught years ago now from a string of incredible teachers in lots of disciplines. In fact, now's a good moment to mention and thank them for everything they offered me, as they're the reason I'm here today, still working as a musician and still enjoying a career as a teacher and still not getting bored. Some of my teachers left indelible marks on my musicianship and personality, and some of them made such an impression that it took me a decade to truly understand the wisdom they were offering me at the time. But that something stuck with me all these years later. Probably the teacher I refer to most often in lessons is David Horn, who taught me composition at the Royal Northern College of Music in my second, third and fourth years. He's an incredible teacher who now, many years later, still runs the graduate school at the RNCM and teaches. I always remember him talking about going against the grain in order to progress, which was his way of saying, work hard. In other words, if you're not feeling the friction, then you're probably taking the easy route. And I've held onto that wisdom throughout my life, in all aspects, not only when it comes to making music. He also instilled a sense of play in my approach to music, as I'm naturally quite serious, and he instilled a sense of rigour and discipline, as I'm naturally very emotional. I guess what he could see was who I was in an effortless way, emotional and serious, and stretched my musical muscles in the opposite, or complementary, direction. I remember him very vividly saying something like, you could sneeze at a page of manuscript paper, or maybe it wasn't so gross, throw ink at a page, and wherever the notes landed, it would sound gorgeous. In other words, I had a natural ear for harmony, which was a huge compliment. But also, as I found that pretty easy, he made me do endless rhythmic exercises and studies, as that's where my weakness lay. It certainly wasn't very natural for me to start with rhythm as the first idea. I suppose from this, remembering these ideas 20 years later, I've highlighted as well as the fact that teaching is listening, learning is also listening, obviously. And that it really is a two-way dialogue and a truly creative act to try to communicate with someone in a way that helps them grow and in turn helps you to grow too. I'd love to go into as much anecdotal detail with my other teachers over the years, some who taught me for many years, like my gymnastics coach Mark Hudson and my school music teachers Gary Hume and Stan Beatty, and the wonderful late Simon Bainbridge, a composer, all of whom offered me invaluable insight into both the craft and ways of seeing life in new perspectives. More recently, I'm indebted to my genius singing teacher Louise Shepherd, whose X-ray vision of my musical muscles and construct from one phrase of a song that I sing has offered me so much insight about how to release, control, grow, and strengthen my singing and range over the past couple of years, despite my inability to stick to weekly lessons. In some ways, I am a culmination of all of their combined wisdom and approaches, which is an exciting prospect for me to think about that. Never mind how it must be for my pupils getting the filtered wisdom of all my teachers through my own take on life and music. I also had a year or so with the incredible Gerald Gregory, a violinist who was a contemporary of mine at the RNCM, who reconstructed my violin technique from scratch, from the ground up, when I was about 19. He really is the reason I have a career as a violinist right now, thanks to his calm, relaxed, meditative approach, as he taught me to let go over a rather painful 6 or 9 months of only playing open strings. Very painful at the time, but gosh, am I grateful now for that intervention, or I wouldn't have a career. I'm also very lucky to have had much more fleeting interactions with fellow composers and musicians over the years in workshops and masterclasses and rehearsals, all of whom left an impression. The composers James Macmillan, Julian Anderson, John Caskin, everyone's favourite mentor Colin Matthews, the late great Oliver Nusson, whose summary of my music led him to a one-word lesson, clarity, which is worth unpicking in another podcast one day. The excellent violinist Cleo Gould, and actually her younger brother Thomas Gould, both of whom shared incredible insight when rehearsing music I'd written. Melinda Maxwell, the best oboist I've had the pleasure to work with on new music. Marina Poplavskaya, opera singer formerly with the Royal Opera House, who also worked on music of mine in a very small room backstage, and whose voice almost overwhelmed me with its power. And of course a career-long collaborator, Catherine Broderick, a world-class soprano and dear friend who came up with me through music college and who I moved to London with. I've learned so much about what not to write from her very honest feedback. I sort of feel the need now to list all of my friends and all of the musicians I've ever worked with, which is of course not only impossible, perhaps indulgent on my part. But suffice to say, if I've worked with you, or I'm even acquainted with you, chances are I've learned something, even if you weren't trying to teach me anything in the first place. I think what I've realised is that I'm very much a natural teacher or mentor, and I used to think that was because I was a know-it-all and that I needed to stop that habit. I'm certainly working on the habit of not offering advice unless it's asked for, or at least checking before I offer it. But I do think I'm quite natural at the idea of seeing the problem and then offering a solution in bite-sized digestible chunks in a way that I can see it's being of some use to the other person. As I said earlier, my partner, who knows me very well indeed, often jokes that every moment is a teachable moment when he catches me explaining something. And God, really, I hope I never come across as a mansplainer. But I'm often so excited about the prospect of sharing knowledge that I forget to listen to the temperature of the conversation or what the other person actually needs from me, in real life anyway, maybe not in lessons. I'm getting much better at that the more I teach, but it's rare that I run out of steam when it comes to the active service of teaching. I suppose that's where I need to work on my boundaries to save some energy for myself. Suffice to say that teaching is listening. It's not limited to music, or any academic subject for that matter. It can be practical, emotional, or social, whatever. But I found the best lessons I always had as a pupil were when I felt heard, or seen, or truly understood. And I think deep down that's probably all anybody wants. What's so beautiful about this process of being a teacher myself and simultaneously learning myself, taking singing lessons, for example, putting myself in the shoes of my students as a learner, is that whether people are learning violin, piano, music theory, composition, it's such a gift to be in that dialogue or discourse that when you truly listen, you become both the teacher and the learner. And that's such a gift to learn so much about myself and others. I hope you enjoyed my perspectives on teaching. I definitely enjoy teaching. And if you're interested in taking a lesson online or in my studio in London, or if you just want some advice about where to find a teacher for yourself, perhaps it's an instrument that I don't teach, then do get in touch via the link in my website, jordan-hunt.com/teaching. And there's a little link to get in touch. But either way, appropriate for today's podcast, thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, and review this podcast. And if you like it, share it with your friends or on social media. You can find me on all social platforms by searching at Jordan Hunt Music, and you can listen to my music on all good streaming services. Deep Down uses bits of my music nabbed from my songs Ocean Floor and Peter. Check out the show notes on jordan-hunt.com for exclusive tidbits from this podcast. I'd really love to hear from you via DM or email via my website if any of these experiences resonated with you, and if you have questions, suggestions, or requests for future episodes. Thank you so much for listening.